Professor Siler, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Samuel.
So you analyze answers to questions on Jeopardy. That sounds like a fun project. What do you hope to learn by studying the game show?
Well, I guess I'll preface this by saying this wasn't really an ordinary project for me. I guess I'll give you a bit of background. I first conceived this idea once I was locked down in Quebec during the winter due to the COVID-19 restrictions. So I couldn't go outside, I couldn't talk to people. And I kind of joked to myself, this is how I got to travel the world while locked in my apartment during the pandemic. In this case, it's a little bit different than what I usually do in that I really didn't have big presuppositions. I found the really interesting data. And so I was kind of thinking inductively here. I have this very rich data set of 300,000 questions asked on Jeopardy, answered by some very smart people. And I was pretty confident there'd be interesting things I'd find, but I wasn't sure exactly what. And I guess maybe I'll go back to my undergraduate days where I was reading some Noam Chomsky, as undergraduates often do. And I always remember reading Manufacturing Consent, the book, where he kind of makes a point, the New York Times covered, 3 people dying in Germany or Ireland or some Western European countries. That was front page news. And yes, that's a tragedy. But, 3,000 dying in Sudan, 800 dying in East Timor, that doesn't get any attention. So why do we value some people more than others in the media and how we think? So I don't think I was going to find anything that macabre in Jeopardy clues, but just that general idea. And especially as I'm working in a library science department, the issue of representation of knowledge, curating knowledge, disseminating knowledge, broadcasting knowledge, that's really been at the forefront of my mind. So all those things kind of came together to inspire me to do this project.
So you're investigating this possibility of systematic differences in geographic coverage. Why might there be such differences? Speaking theoretically,
Yeah, it's not necessarily nefarious. I use the analogy in the paper, there's some places in the world that we view through a microscope. And Jeopardy, it's like the United States, Western Europe. And there's other places in the world that we view through a telescope. And it's by necessity. Of course, we're going to notice the things close to us a lot more than the things far from us. We can't know everything. And there's benefits of specialization. If you grow up in Canada like me or the United States like me, you probably know North America pretty well, just because it's important to your life and it's close and everything. But then beyond that, Australia might be far away geographically, but culturally, linguistically, it's not so far away. And so I wanted to kind of sketch out just how knowledge institutions, I know Jeopardy is just a game show. It's a game show that has cultural significance and cachet, but this happens in libraries, this happens in academia, any sort of place where we have knowledge, we have these, I don't know if they're biases, but these vantage points that we can't take everything in. We have to make trade-offs between breadth and depth. And I think it's just important to know where we have these kind of blind spots or dark spots or gray spots where, okay, we're looking through the telescope and we aren't necessarily getting the whole story. And yeah, it's just important to be cognizant of that no matter what you do.
So that's why we might, that makes sense of why we might expect there to be systematic differences. But is there any reason to suspect or any argument that, Jeopardy wouldn't have such differences?
That's a fair question. And I'll preface this by saying I think Jeopardy is an extraordinarily well-written show. They have some very experienced writers, but they also have an extensive staff of fact checkers and people that make sure the questions are well written. There's a clear, unambiguous answer. So, and they're quite mindful of issues of representation. I know over time they've increased questions about women. And Jeopardy is an omnivorous show, which means, you're kind of expected to know everything in the world. I guess Ken Jennings, who is a current co-host and, a great champion who won 75 straight games, he just said, look, Jeopardy can ask you about anything ever in any part of human history, It's a cool thing about the show. You'll get, questions about fast food restaurants and NASCAR and hockey and cartoons, but you'll also be asked about Shakespeare and Greek gods and goddesses and science and literature. So because they have that omnivorous focus, then yes, maybe there would be less of a bias than you'd expect ordinarily in the American media. But I guess that'd be the countervailing argument. Although if you watch a show, you can kind of see there's with good reason, a strong American focus. There's nothing wrong with that. You're an American show writing for an American audience. So there's interest, but then people also have interest in looking through that telescope once in a while. What's going on the metaphorical other side of the world?
So one dimension that you studied was, because you studied several dimensions of this question of, what's being covered. So one dimension, just to get us started, that you studied was how often a country or some place in the country was a correct answer to questions.
Right. And I'll preface this by saying there's one country, or like the 197 official countries in the world, according to the World Bank, that has never been the sole answer to a question on Jeopardy, and that's Comoros. And that's a country I don't think I've thought of in decades. And okay, now I have thought a fair amount about it, but so now I'm kind of hoping like this year's Tournament of Champions final Jeopardy is going to be a Comoros question. That'd be like the great way to break the 38-year slump of Comoros. But having said that, yes, there's kind of a sharply exponential distribution. The United States they get more than half of all geography questions. And once again, it's an American show. So yes, people will know, Black Hills National Park in South Dakota, or, they'll know some pretty obscure places. It's where they grew up. It's the history books they generally read. Whereas in Africa, you might get a question about Lake Victoria or the Sahara Desert. But there isn't a lot that Americans know or just people pay attention to. So you have to ask more in-depth clues about America. But beyond America, you see Canada. Okay, this might be the Alex Trebek effect because he was Canadian, but Canada and the United Kingdom are second and third in questions asked. And it's very kind of Western Europe centric. So, Guatemala or Belize is closer, certainly Mexico is closer to the United States geographically than the UK or Germany or France or Australia, yet they're culturally further away. And I guess I'll just add one more thing that struck out to me as, a Canadian and North American. There were 3 times as many questions about Canada as there are about Mexico, and both of them border the United States. That might be a concession to the fact that, yes, we have Jeopardy in Canada as well, but, Mexico, they have a different official language. It's a bit of a different economic niche in the world economy. So it's not just distance from America, it's also cultural distance and what people care about for whatever reason.
So was this, what about issues like size of the country or income? Were those things mattering or not?
Oh, absolutely. I did multivariate analyses, and even when you put everything in the model, like the size of the country, obviously larger countries get asked about, and wealthier countries get asked about much more often. I'll put an interesting twist on that, though, and also there's regional differences. Of course, North America gets a lot, followed by Europe, East Asia, and then last is South Asia and Africa, or specifically Sub-Saharan Africa. An interesting part of that, though, is when you do get the odd question about Africa or East Timor or Nepal, kind of like less common places asked on Jeopardy, they tend to be in difficult clues, so they're worth more money. So yes, the frequency is lower, but the difficulty is higher. And so you might not be expected to know much about most countries in the world. For like 100 of like the 197 countries in the world, according to the World Bank, like for half of them on Jeopardy, you just need to know the name of the country, that it exists, and maybe its capital city. And that's half of the world right there. But yes, income and land do make a difference. With the caveat, I come from a country that's mostly frozen rock and tundra where nobody lives. So yeah, just because there's land doesn't mean it's important. But yes, having more land does make it more likely you'll be asked about.
Yeah, you had this interesting contrast between a couple of countries, Monaco and I can't remember another country. And
the microstates.
Yes.
For some reason, Jeopardy writers love asking about European microstates. Monaco, Liechtenstein, San Marino, Andorra, Gibraltar, although that's not a country. For some reason, the Jeopardy writers just love tripping up questions. And contestants often get fooled by them. Perhaps that's why they like doing it. But I just put it in contrast. Okay, Monaco has 38,000 people and is 2 square kilometers, whereas Algeria has 38 million people, and I don't know the square area off the top of my head, but it's ginormous. And yet Monaco got the same number of questions as Algeria. And that just struck me as, and I realize there's a lot of money in Monaco, but still, I mean, that's pretty jarring. So what I did in the paper was I contrasted the types of questions asked about European microstates with those asked about sub-Saharan Africa. And long story short, basically the questions about sub-Saharan Africa were extremely simple, but perceived as difficult. Like they'll ask a question about the Central African Republic, and they will say, okay, this country has the initial CAR. I mean, that's a very simple clue. Whereas if they're going to ask about Luxembourg or Andorra, like it's not an obvious question. So it's just the writers, and perhaps with good reason, they presuppose more knowledge of even European microstates as Andorra, or sorry, as Africa. I think when that becomes a problem is when we prioritize Monaco just as much as we do Algeria. And I'm sure Monaco is very interesting, but 2 square kilometers.
But yeah, you had multiple examples, Vatican City and so forth. So it wasn't just one outlier,
Yeah.
It was a reflecting a pattern. So what might explain these patterns? I mean, you had this idea in the paper of information deserts, which I thought, well, what is an information desert and how does it, what makes it, what's the definition of information desert and what makes it be a desert? What's behind it?
I love that question. I'll just say first and foremost, okay, Jeopardy's a show. It's entertainment. They're selling advertising. And as an aside, political advertisers love advertising on Jeopardy. You get an older demographic, kind of a thoughtful demographic, and they're the types of people that are sometimes easy to convince. I mean, Jeopardy is popular among senior citizens. Contestants, I think, are overwhelmingly liberal and educated, but the viewership is more omnivorous. So, and so they have to make a show that's entertaining. It's highbrow. It's a little out of reach for most of us, including myself, unless they're asking about Canada. But they do have to make it entertaining. So I think that's part of the thing that motivates question choice on Jeopardy, and good reason. It is entertainment. But the information deserts concept I kind of took from the concept of food deserts, which is a big problem in the United States, where it's basically there's places, geographic areas that do not have access to affordable, healthy food. There is no grocery store. There is no fresh produce. I went to grad school in upstate New York, and 45 minutes south of me in Binghamton, there's this neighborhood, overwhelmingly poor, overwhelmingly racial minorities, cut off by the interstate in like the 50s. They have no grocery store. They have no bus to take them to a grocery store. And so that's terrible for people's health and their lives. But so I adapted that kind of depressing concept to the notion of information deserts. And this happens in 2 ways. Firstly, I mean, how can we know what's going on in Burkina Faso or Madagascar or Bangladesh when these are countries that are struggling with financial issues, struggle with stability? And I realize the internet can be an equalizer, but curating, presenting, disseminating information, that's costly. It takes expertise. Sometimes there's linguistic gaps to fill. So there's places in the world where they just don't collect and store their information, or they aren't able to archive things quite as well as we do in the United States or in Canada or in most developed countries. And then, so that's part of the problem. And then, I think I covered it there.
So in this, what I take from this is that there's information in people's living, but it's not recorded in a way. So it's almost as if the information there's no access for the writers, for limited access for the writers of a show like Jeopardy. To bring it into their project, because
absolutely. Okay, and now you made me remember the second half of my answer. There's another trivia league, a very highbrow trivia league that often Jeopardy alumni participate in. It's called Learned League, and it's kind of exclusive. You need to be invited in, but it's extremely popular. And it's run by one fellow, and he was a lawyer that had a terrible job that he just procrastinated and racked up billable hours, just making up fun trivia questions for his friends, and then it just kind of snowballed, and it turned into this, like, I think now 20,000 person online trivia league. And he alone writes the questions. He alone does all the work. It's his full-time job. And he says a big challenge I have writing questions for this very sophisticated highbrow audience is that the history books of the world are just full of straight white European dudes. And I want to have a trivia quiz that's much more inclusive, that's broader. It's both, one, the right thing to do, and it's more interesting if you're asking about more than just white dudes from Africa, white dudes from Europe, although South Africa gets a fair amount of questions. So for Africa, so there are white dudes in Africa that are taken seriously, apparently. And so that applies to gender. Like, women have often been excluded from the history books of the world. So, like, even if things are better today, and it's easy to make sure we have kind of equal questions about men and women, sampling from different places in the world, historically, what's been codified, what's been maintained in the world's knowledge base is often very limited to, straight, wealthy white men. And what can you really do about that? Because asking about history is definitely an important thing in the world. It's important about trivia. So that's a challenge that I think the Jeopardy writers have, and perhaps one you can't entirely solve. But yeah, it's definitely a challenge.
So it sounds like, so with the study of Jeopardy, it's a game show. You're right. It's entertainment. It can also be a teaching opportunity. People learn about things that they didn't know. But it sounds like you're going beyond using Jeopardy to go beyond Jeopardy. And I felt like in your paper at points you were saying, ready to say something or thinking about saying something about knowledge in general. So does your study show, I mean, maybe it was just me reading into it. Does your study say anything about knowledge in general and acquisition, recognition?
You're an astute reader. You're on to me. I mean, I'm glad you noticed that. Yes, I mean, I'm a sociologist of science. And yeah, and I guess working on science and working on issues of information in libraries kind of inspired me to do this. And yes, I mean, like, the Dewey Decimal System is full of all sorts of biases, US states each have a number, and like the entire continent of Africa has one number in the Dewey Decimal System. Once again, this kind of telescope, microscope dichotomy. And yes, I think that's something that's exciting. And once again, I was a little self-deprecating early on. Okay, this wasn't some great theoretical sociological study, that at least it wasn't rooted in some great sociological theory. I just wanted to look at data. But I really think, the stories, the things we learn from looking at Jeopardy, we can look at all sorts of knowledge institutions in the world. And, knowledge is power. It's a knowledge economy. And so, and I realize that, and for good reason, we might specialize in the areas and the things that are close to us, that are important to us. But I think it's also important to recognize blind spots, whether we want to fill them in, and sometimes realize where our strengths and weaknesses are. And that what we take as normal, what we take as, what's important in the world isn't necessarily the case from different vantage points. So I think there's all sorts of different institutions that we can and should look at down the road.
So one question I had also was, I mean, I don't mean to criticize Jeopardy is, like they're not doing something that's easy to do, and why don't they do it? There's some moral failing or something. Mm-hmm. But it's not like that at all. But it makes me wonder what counts as an omnivorous entity, does how much, and so it made me wonder, if we're going to call Jeopardy omnivorous, what's the grounding? How do we get there? And if we're not, is it because of what the kind of work that you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm thinking, like, I'll make an analogy, omnivorousness, like the omnivore that will eat everything, plants, meat, whatever. And if, the plate of Jeopardy, you would have, like, the United States and Western Europe as a main course. But you also will sample a little bit. It's like you'll have maybe a little side of Africa on the side, or South Asia. So yes, like, omnivorous means, like, okay, where the third NASCAR race of the year is, like probably somewhere in South Carolina or something. But it also means the capital of Eritrea or of East Timor. So So yes, there's omnivorousness, but some things are sampled more than others. And I guess that's kind of one of the ideas I tried to convey in the article is that, okay, you can be omnivorous, but also have stark inequalities within that omnivorousness. So yeah, you're open to everything, but some things you consume more than others.
I see. Okay, so now I guess, okay, I've read your paper, I've talked to you about this, and then I go and watch Jeopardy. Do your findings or your work, things that maybe didn't make it into the paper, but you have a sensitivity now that you may not have had before, does your experience suggest anything we might change in how we think or what we think when we watch Jeopardy and other trivia shows? Or is it just, it's telling us something about knowledge and the way we use it and the way we have access to it, but it's not feeding back into anything that we should do differently when we sit down to watch the show?
I guess in a previous life, I did research on poker, so I'm pretty sensitive to issues of risk and luck. And before I did this research, I would religiously watch Jeopardy every week and very, very carefully track my score and my performance. Now, I'm not particularly good, but I just noticed there's a lot of variance from day to day. And sometimes I'm not getting smarter or dumber from day to day for the most part, or if I am, there's probably not a big difference. But there's a lot of luck in the categories you get asked. I mean, if you think about it, it's a pretty small sample size. You get 60 clues on the big blue board and then Final Jeopardy. So 61. And yeah, you've got the whole world to sample from. So some days I just happen to get stuff I know, and other days I'm completely clueless. And I'm sure that happens with some contestants. It's kind of embarrassing. You get up there, you're really smart, and then you completely crash. So I think about the luck from day to day and how, somebody's in the negative or something or having a bad day, you feel sorry for them. It's just they might know a ton, but just not the 10 categories they got asked that day. And I also, what I really think of, and this is kind of the future work I want to do, it's I wonder what Jeopardy would like and how the winners would change, or how people who would go on the show and be successful, how they would change if, for example, what if we had 20% more sports questions, or 20% more science questions, or 10% fewer theater questions? Different people would win. Different people with different backgrounds would win. And it's just a very subtle thing. If Jeopardy increased the number of sports questions by 10%, I don't think people would really notice. But that makes a difference in who wins a game. For example, men overwhelmingly do better in sports. There's other categories where women do well in. So there's a tie-in with occupational sex segregation here. And I don't think this will ever make it into print. But I also looked at the occupations of professions, and predictably, things like doctors did really well. Medical doctors did really well in medicine and science. High school teachers did extremely well in Shakespeare because they're probably often having to indoctrinate high school students. Blue collar professions, they did very poorly on colleges and universities, but did well on things like food. Amazingly, they were homemakers. They did quite well in royalty, celebrity gossip. And I guess another thing that I can probably never make into print, but another thing that struck me is in the 1980s, a lot of women contestants were homemakers. I'll gather they tended to be upper middle class, but it just struck me as kind of a younger person who was just a kid back then. Back then, a lot of smart women weren't in the workforce, but they probably read a lot of books at home and became really smart on their own. But so kind of small details that, the what's the saying, the director's cut that you're getting now. But yeah.
Well, one implication of what you just said, though, is that who gets certified as the winner and the most knowledgeable depends greatly on the questions and even though the way you talked about it in this example, and this, which was, makes sense to talk about how they could the shifting of the categories, but the fact that you might have 4 categories on, that sample various things that are very much in the particular community that you're embedded in, and then one category might be, South America. Very simple questions like, what is the capital of this country? If you change that pattern, that it was 4 categories on, some that was embedded in some country in South America, and one
Yeah.
category, North America. And you might ask one
Yeah.
question, what's the capital of the United States? And then,
Yeah.
it changes who gets certified as
Yeah.
knowledgeable.
Exactly.
And obviously the audience wants, if it's a show in the United States, of course it's going to be the former, not the latter.
Yeah.
But it does sensitize us that this category that we're certifying, this person's knowledgeable, is greatly dependent on the questions we're asking to symbolize having knowledge. And
Right. I mean, the gender, I hope to do more work on gender, and this might end up in print. But something that struck me, like maybe a few months ago, there was a question on dresses when I was tracking my score and trying to do as well as possible. And okay, I'm a heteronormative man. Like, I know zero about dresses. But I'm like, this is fair. They ask about Michael Jordan. They ask about LeBron James. It's fair that I get asked about dresses. And I went 0 for 5 in that category. But it's also important that, as heteronormative men, and have to learn about dresses a little bit too. And so I guess you're a sociologist of education, and something I think about is like standardized testing. Why did we decide that calculus is so important for determining like who gets to go to college and so forth? And maybe there's good reasons, especially with the STEM majors who want people with certain backgrounds. But, I just imagine like who does well in the SAT depends in part on the questions they decide to ask and how they try to weight different types of knowledge. So once again, I mean, Jeopardy is a really important game show, but it's just a game show. But I think these principles about knowledge, inclusion, and what we choose to question and value is really, really important beyond this game show.
Professor Siler, this was it was illuminating paper to read. I found myself trying to figure out, well, would I be able to get any of these questions? Because you had a few questions in there, and I won't. There's no reason to talk about what I would have done, how well I would have done, so I won't. But I thought that you also did. It was fascinating because it connected to these other things as well. I want to thank you for doing this, what turns out to be important work, and for coming in and sharing it with us today.
Oh, thanks. This is a lot of fun. It was an honor. Thanks so much.